Is apostasia in 2 Thessalonians 2:3 a reference to the rapture or to apostasy? Did the early English translations really intend to communicate physical departure when they used the word departure as a translation for apostasia? Were the early English translations really attempting to communicate the rapture in this verse? Or are men being bamboozled by a slick argument that seriously misrepresents the facts? Stay tuned for the results of a deep, diligent investigation on this matter. Hi there, I'm Lee Brainerd. Welcome to Soothkeep and another edition of Prophecy in the Crucible. My mission is truth, truth at any cost, truth above every other consideration. Now, in 2 Thessalonians 2:3 we read, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition." Now, the word translated falling away here in the King James Version is apostasia in the original Greek. And there is a recent teaching which insists that apostasia here should be translated by departure, and that this is a reference to the physical departure of the church in the rapture. Now, the argument for this case makes a number of points. First of all, it says all of the early English versions featured departure. It claims that all of the early versions in the English meant physical departure when they used the word or translation departure. They claim further that the Latin Vulgate uses the translation discessio, which means departure. They claim that the Reims Bible in 1582 was the first non-departure translation to appear when it used the word revolt. They claim that in 1611, the King James Version was the first Protestant version to have a non-departure rendering of apostasia, and it featured falling away. They also claim that Beza was the first person to transliterate the Greek word apostasia, and he ended up also coining the English word apostasy. And finally, this argument culminates with the fact that there was a secret Catholic conspiracy to get rid of the pre-tribulation rapture by introducing bogus apostasy translations. Folks, when I first heard about this theory, I read a very popular book on the subject. I did a deep dive. I investigated other papers on the subject, including a master's thesis. I read chapters in different books that had incorporated this in their commentaries and in their prophecy books. I looked at about a dozen different books written by and papers written by well-known names. I wanted to believe the theory, but I wasn't going to just jump on the bandwagon without doing some serious research. When I researched the English translation and the Bible translation argument, I came to realize there's some serious flaws. Folks, I'm just going to tell you plain out. The entire Bible translation argument for apostasia being a reference to the rapture in 2 Thessalonians 2:3, the entire presentation is fiction. Every point that it makes is false. Every point that it makes is a falsehood. And this is easily demonstrated if we go to the historical source material. So let's take up these points one by one. But before I do that, let me answer a question that a lot of people are probably thinking. It's like, okay, Brother Lee has put out quite a few videos on this subject, and he's appeared on talk shows on this subject. Why does he care so much about this one point? It's a small point. Well, the interpretation of this verse, in far as this word goes, is relatively small. But it's not entirely a small point. Folks, methodology is everything. Are we careful or are we sloppy in our research? Are we thorough or are we superficial in our research? If we get our methodology right, We're going to be right on everything in theory, and we will make great gains within the boundaries of that methodology. But if we get our methodology wrong, it's going to color all of our thinking, all of our theology, and all of our investigation. Methodology, folks, is everything. And that's why I take passages like this and make an issue out of it, because the passage illustrates bad methodology. Now, let's go on to the points. All of the early English versions, it's claimed, use the word departure. Folks, this claim is false. It's simply not true. Wycliffe, in his 1380, his 1382, and his 1388 editions, used the word dissension. Now, in 1382, it's interesting that he used the word dissension, but he used it as an alternate for the word departing. Now, the fact that he would have the word departing and then give dissension as an alternative reading or translation implies that in his mind, the two words were synonyms. Now, the authoritative editions of Wycliffe is the Bagster's Hexapla and Forshaw and Madden's edition in 1850, which examined many manuscripts of Wycliffe's Bible. So if you want to get an authoritative understanding of what Wycliffe's translations were, folks, you need to use the authoritative editions. Don't just go to Blue Letter Bible and pick up whatever comes up. Now, there's also an earlier version that preceded Wycliffe, and that's found in the Cursor Mundi. Now, it doesn't have the full New Testament in it, but it quotes a lot of scripture. One of the passages it quotes is 2 Thessalonians 2:3. So, in 1300, we see 2 Thessalonians 2:3 with the translation, "First let there be dissension, ere," that is before, "the Antichrist shall come into the land." So in 1300, there was a translation available to the churchmen and to the nobles that had the word dissension in 2 Thessalonians 2:3. Now, the second argument they make is that all of the early English versions meant physical departure when they used the word departure. But folks, this is completely bogus. It's a falsehood. We're going to look at introductions to 2 Thessalonians and introductions to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And we're going to look at marginal notes. And we're going to see that these versions, the editors and the translators, tell us exactly what they believed the passage meant. So looking at the introductions to 2 Thessalonians, we see in the Geneva Bible in 1560 and in 1569, we read that in the introduction, "Before that day, there should be a falling away from true religion, and that Antichrist should reign in the temple of God." In the Matthew's Bible in 1537, we read, "The day of the Lord shall not come till the departing from the faith come first." Now, in the Great Bible in 1540, in the Tyndale Matthews in 1551, in the Geneva Bible in 1557 and 1560 and 1569, and in the Bishop's Bible in 1568, we read in the introduction, "departing from the faith." And further, in the Geneva Thompson 1596, which is also known as the Beza Bible, we read, "departure from the faith, and that Antichrist shall be revealed." So in all of these versions that we looked at in the introduction to 2 Thessalonians, we see that they're meant by departing a departure from the faith. Now let's look at some examples of the marginal notes. In the Coverdale Bible in 1535 and in 1553, we read in the text that there will be a departing come first, and it has an asterisk, and that asterisk takes us to a marginal note which refers us to two texts. Daniel chapter 9 verses 25 through 27, which is a reference to the abomination of desolation, and 1 Timothy chapter 4, the first few verses, in which this section starts with the words, "In the latter times some shall depart from the faith." Very similar thing in the Tyndale Matthews 15:51, we read in the text, "a departing first," there's an asterisk, and it points us to the same to Daniel 9:24 through 27 and the abomination of the desolation. In the Geneva Bible in 1560 and in 1569, the marginal note to this phrase, "a departing," we read, "a wonderful departing of the most part from the faith." Doesn't get any clearer than that what they meant. And in the Geneva Thompson translation of 1595, which is the Beza Bible, the phrase in the text, "except there coming a departing first," has a footnote that says, "that wicked man shall sit, and many shall fall away from God to him." Again, you can't get any clearer to what they were trying to convey. They were all talking about a spiritual departure from the faith, not a physical departure from earth. Now, the third argument that they bring out is that the Latin Vulgate translation discussio means physical departure. Folks, this is bogus. There's absolutely nothing in this argument. If you look at the Latin lexicons, I don't care which ones you go to. I used Castle's, Lewis and Short, the Oxford Latin lexicon. You'll discover that the translation, that the sense of physical departure is really rare for discussio. Discussio was mostly used, just like the Greek apostasia, for political division and for religious separation or religious apostasy. Furthermore, we don't have to have a debate over which meaning in the lexicon we should be deferring to, because Jerome, in his letter to Algasium, commented on 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, and he gave us what he meant with his translation of apostasia. He believed that apostasia, the Greek word apostasia, had the meaning of dissension or division, and he regarded the apostasia in this passage as the vassals of Rome rebelling against Rome. There you have it. Jerome himself tells us what he meant in the Latin Vulgate with the translation of discussio. Now, furthermore, some editions of the Latin Vulgate, like the 1522 Complutensian edition, they give us dissentio in the text instead of discussio. And dissentio is where we get the English word dissension. And it just means dissension. And further yet for the Latin, in the Itala, that is the Old Latin that was used by Tertullian, and that's prior to Jerome's Latin Vulgate translation, we find the word obscessio instead of discussio. Now, these two words were synonyms. So again, you're going to be having to do a little dictionary gymnastics here, depending to see which way you should go. But we don't have to. Because Tertullian, in his commentary on 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, tells us what sense he meant. And in his commentary, he tells us that he meant political division or political separation, the same sense that Jerome had. So there's no sense in these Latin versions of physical departure. Now, another argument that we're given is that the Reims Bible in 1582 was the first Bible translation with a non-departure reading, and it used the word revolt. Folks, this is a big nope. This is bogus. The 1568 Bishop's Bible had falling away. The Bishop's Bible preceded the Catholic Reims Bible by some 14 years. And it preceded by several more decades the King James Version. And the Bishop's Bible didn't come from the Catholics. Furthermore, in 1529, Luther gave us Apfalla, which meant falling away. And his version deeply influenced all the following English translations. Prior to Luther, the 1522 Complutensian Vulgate had dissentio, which means dissension. And in 1466 through about 1518, there were 20 editions of the Mentel Bible in Germany. And this Bible featured Misshellung, which was regularly used in the literature of that day for political revolt and insurrection. And when we go back further, we go to Wycliffe in 1380. We're still in the English language and in the immediate English, Dutch, German family. We have in Wycliffe in 1380, Wycliffe 1382, Wycliffe 1388, we see the word dissension. But we go back even further. We can go back to the Cursor Mundi, which I mentioned earlier, in 1300. And guess what we find in 2 Thessalonians 2:3? Again, dissension. And we can go all the way back in this language family to about 350 AD, or AD 350, with the Wulfala, or the Gothic translation, which features afstas, which means standing off or falling away. Now, another argument is that the King James Bible in 1611 was the first Protestant Bible version to have a non-departure reading when it introduced falling away. This is a big nope. This argument is a falsehood. In 1568, the Bishop's Bible, some 40 years earlier almost, well, about 40 years earlier, had falling away. In 1529, Luther gave us Apfalla, which is falling away. And in 1380, Wycliffe had dissension. So that whole argument is just a falsehood. Now, we also read, we're also told that Beza coined the transliteration apostasia and the English word apostasy. Again, this is a big nope. This is bogus. Beza didn't make an English translation, folks. No, I know that there's a Bible versions out there that have his name on it, but he didn't do an English translation. So it's impossible that an English translation executed by him is the source of the transliteration apostasia and the English word apostasy. The fact is, the Beza Bible is just a Geneva Bible with Beza's notes that were originally in his Greek and Latin edition. Now, all 5 major editions of Beza's Latin translation with his Greek text, the 1556, the 1565, the 1582, the 1588, and the 1598 offer defectio in the text. We don't see apostasia or any related term in the text. Now, furthermore, none of his commentary annotations offered apostasia is either a rendering or an interpretation or an explanation. Now, on top of that, Beza did lend his hand to the French version, the Olivetan version, and in that version in 1535 was introduced the word deportment. And that was changed in later versions to revolt. But this, again, the French doesn't support the theory that he introduced the transliteration apostasia or the word apostasy. But the strongest reason why Beza can't be held guilty for introducing the transliteration apostasia or the English word apostasy is that the words appeared in the French and English and Latin languages long before Beza. Apostasia is attested in French as early as 1305. Apostasy is found in the English writings in the early 1300s in Wycliffe and in Purvey. And apostasia was common in the Latin is a Latin transliteration in Latin for 1,000 years. before Beza. Well, this raises the question then, what was Beza's actual role in this whole situation? Well, he introduced a non-departure reading in the translation in 1556 when he introduced defectio. He introduced a non-departure translation in the French in 1558 when he introduced revolt. And these translations preceded the Bishop's Bible in 1568, the Reims Bible in 1582, and the King James in 1611. But they didn't precede Luther's 1529 with Upfala. They didn't precede the Vulgate in 1522 with Dissentio. They didn't precede Wycliffe in 1380 with his dissension, and they didn't precede the Cursor Mundi in 1300 with dissension. So Beza didn't introduce the concept of an apostasy translation, much less introduce the transliteration apostasia, or the translation of the English word apostasy. So the bottom line here, folks, there was no conspiracy. It is complete fiction that undiscerning Protestants were overcome by a Catholic conspiracy to remove the rapture from 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, and replace it by apostasy. This is a bogus theory that belongs in the same category as the King James only theory. So what is the correct explanation for the change from departure translations to falling away in rebellion translations? Well, as the Reformation got rolling along, men understood that renderings like dissension and departure simply weren't strong enough to represent the spirit of error that was in the Catholic Church. They began to see we're not merely dealing with some mistakes in understanding. They were dealing with a willful rejection of light and truth. Terms like dissension, disagreement, and departure just seemed too weak. So they decided to go with more robust terms like falling away and apostasy and rebellion, which presented the iniquity of the Roman Catholic Church and all of her children later on in bas relief. So in conclusion, folks, the Bible version argument for the rapture understanding of 2 Thessalonians 2:3 is a rat's nest of mistakes and misrepresentations and fabrications. It involved the selective use of data. It involved a superficial investigation. It was shoddy research. It was ad hoc methodology. We are forced to conclude that the argument for the rapture interpretation based on the Bible versions is driven by presupposition and superstition, not by robust evangelical investigation. It's the same kind of argumentation and the same kind of superstition that we see in the King James only argument. So, folks, when it comes to questions like this, we need to go broad and deep in our investigation and research. We must go to the actual source materials. We absolutely must test the presuppositions. We must test all things. We must prove all things, and only hold fast to those things which pass the test. We must be Bereans, folks, not in name only, but in practice. Now, if you want to go deeper on this subject, order a copy of my book, Apostasia, which answers every argument made for the rapture understanding of apostasia in 2 Thessalonians 2:3. The body of the book, it's a thick book, but I'll just tell you ahead of time, the body of the book is only 80 pages. And those 80 pages are jam-packed with useful information and facts. And there's over 200 pages. There's over 220 pages of technical footnotes and appendices which include a boatload of information that's helpful to understand the interpretation of this verse. There's 2 years of research in this book, folks. And my buddy Mondo Gonzalez wrote the foreword for it. So if you care about the right understanding of 2 Thessalonians 2:3 and the understanding of the Greek word apostasia and how it's best translated and how it's best understood, this book belongs in your library. Eyes wide open, brain engaged, heart on fire. We'll see you next time.